for the racism which apparently was aimed at Meghan Markle, which is just completely absurd. But by far the most sickening part of this show for me.
He knew her before the palace. He watched her change after it. And the one mistake Piers Morgan says Meghan Markle made is the reason everything that followed became inevitable. The man who knew her first before the palace, or Harry. Before the wedding watched by hundreds of millions of people across the globe. There was dinner. A quiet, unremarkable dinner at a members' club in London in 2016. Two people sitting across a table, talking, laughing, getting along in the easy, unguarded way that people do, when neither of them yet understands what the other is about to become. One of them was Piers Morgan. The other was Meghan Markle. And what happened between them in the years that followed that dinner is one of the most revealing and misunderstood stories in this entire saga. Because Piers Morgan is not simply a critic of Meghan Markle, he is something far more complicated than that. He is someone who liked her first. That is the detail that gets lost in every headline, and in every television debate, and every furious social media exchange between Morgan's supporters and Meghan's defenders. The feud that eventually consumed both of their public profiles for years did not begin with hostility. It began with warmth. Morgan has spoken about that first dinner multiple times. He describes Meghan as charming, sharp, and extremely good company. He was impressed by her and said so publicly at the time. He followed her on social media and spoke well of her in interviews. He was, by his own admission, a genuine admirer, and that matters. It matters enormously. Because the story of how that admiration curdled into one of the most bitter and public feuds in modern British media history tells you something important, not just about Morgan or Meghan, but about the specific mistake that Morgan argues changed the entire trajectory of her story. Before we get to the mistake itself, you need to understand the man making the accusation. Because Piers Morgan is not a simple figure. He is not easy to dismiss and easy to fully defend. He is, depending on who you ask, either the last honest voice in British media or its most irresponsible loudmouth. He has been fired from jobs and celebrated for the same qualities. Morgan has broken genuine stories and destroyed innocent reputations. He is, in other words, exactly the kind of person whose opinion about you matters, whether you want it to or not. Morgan built his career on access, on relationships, on being inside the room immersive, and understanding what was really happening while everyone outside was being managed. He edited the Daily Mirror for years. He sat across from the most powerful people in British public life, and asked the questions their handlers had specifically told him not to ask. He is not easily fooled or ignored. When Morgan first met Meghan in 2016, she was known primarily as an actress on the American legal drama Suits. Successful, respected within her industry, but not yet a global name, not yet the figure whose every movement generated international headlines. She was, in Morgan's own words, a normal person trying to make her way in a competitive world. He admired that and related to it. They exchanged messages after the dinner, friendly, easy communications. Morgan has said publicly that he considered her a friend, not a close friend, but a genuine one, someone he wished well. Then Harry happened, and everything that followed happened with a speed that even Morgan found difficult to track. Within months of their relationship becoming public, Meghan was no longer simply an actress. She was a global phenomenon. The story of a biracial American woman entering the most traditional institution in the world captured imaginations everywhere. Morgan watched this transformation closely, and he noticed something. The Meghan he had sat across from at dinner in 2016 was beginning to disappear, slowly at first, then faster. The unguarded warmth he remembered was being replaced by something more managed, more careful, and constructed. He reached out at some point during this period. The details of what exactly was communicated have been disputed publicly. Morgan's version is that he sent messages that were not returned, that the access and warmth that had characterized their earlier contact was suddenly and completely withdrawn. He felt ghosted. That word is his word. He has used it repeatedly and specifically. And here is where it gets complicated, because being ghosted by an acquaintance is not, on its own, a story. People get busy, priorities change, relationships shift in intensity without malice or meaning. But Morgan did not experience it that way. He experienced it as a signal a deliberate signal about how Meghan intended to manage her relationships now that she was operating at a different level. Now that she had access to a world that did not require the Piers Morgans of British media to be kept warm. He felt, in his own words, used. And Piers Morgan, as anyone who has observed him across a long career will tell you, does not respond quietly to feeling used. What followed was a public escalation that consumed significant airtime, column inches, and emotional energy on both sides. Morgan became one of Meghan's most persistent and most vocal critics. On Good Morning Britain, in his newspaper columns, on his own television programs. He questioned her motivations, her truthfulness, and her treatment of the royal family with a consistency and a ferocity that his critics described as obsession. Morgan described it differently. He called it accountability. But here's the question that sits at the heart of this entire chapter. And it is a question that neither Morgan's supporters nor Meghan's defenders have fully answered. Would any of this have happened if that dinner in 2016 had simply been followed by a return message? Morgan himself has circled this question without fully landing on it, because the honest answer is uncomfortable for everyone involved. The feud that shaped both of their public profiles for years, the resignation from Good Morning Britain, the television debates, legal actions, and the international headlines. All of it traces back, in some meaningful way, to a relationship that began well and ended without explanation. And Morgan's argument is that the way it ended was not incidental. It was not thoughtlessness or distraction. It was a pattern of behavior that he had the unique position of witnessing from the inside before the rest of the world understood what they were watching. And the clearest expression of that pattern, Morgan argues, was not the ghosting. It was not the feud. It was not even the Oprah interview. It was one specific mistake, one decision made at a precise moment in time. A decision that Morgan says revealed everything about how Meghan understood power, loyalty, and the management of inconvenient relationships. That mistake did not happen in a palace. It did not happen in a television studio, a courtroom, a Netflix boardroom, or a Montecito garden. It happened in a moment that most people completely overlooked at the time. And when Morgan identified it and named it publicly, the reaction from both sides told you exactly how close to the truth he had landed. The mistake. Morgan says, changed everything. There are moments in public life that look small when they happen. No cameras captured them. No journalists reported them. There was no social media storm erupts in the hours that follow. They pass quietly, unremarked, apparently inconsequential. And then, weeks or months or years later, someone looks back and realizes that everything changed in that moment. That the entire trajectory of a story was built on a decision that nobody was paying attention to at the time. Piers Morgan says he found that moment in Meghan Markle's story. And once he identified it, he says, everything else made sense. The palace tensions, staff exits, the Oprah interview, Netflix collapse, fracturing friendships, and the contracting circle. All of it, Morgan argues, flows from one source, one mistake. But to understand the mistake, you first need to understand the context in which it was made. Because the decision did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a very specific point in Meghan's transition from actress to royal, a transition that was moving faster than almost anyone inside the institution had anticipated. By late 2017, Meghan's relationship with Harry was no longer a rumor. It was a confirmed, celebrated, globally covered reality. The engagement was announced in November 2017. The world responded with a warmth and enthusiasm that genuinely surprised even seasoned royal watchers. Here was something new, something modern, something that felt like the monarchy finally catching up with the world it was supposed to represent. The public narrative was perfect, and that is precisely when Meghan made the mistake. Morgan's argument is not complicated. It is actually very simple, and that simplicity is part of what makes it so devastating. The mistake, Morgan says, was this. Meghan decided at the precise moment when she had the most goodwill available to her, to treat the people and institutions around her as instruments rather than partners, not enemies or obstacles, instruments, things to be used while useful, managed when inconvenient, discarded when no longer necessary. Morgan is specific about where he saw this most clearly, not in the palace tensions, staff exits, or even in his own experience of being ghosted after that London dinner. He saw it most clearly in the way Meghan handled the British press in the early months of her royal life. Now, here is what makes this argument interesting. Morgan is not simply defending the British press. He is not arguing that tabloid culture deserves uncritical loyalty, or that royal figures should submit passively to whatever narrative the papers choose to construct. He is arguing something more precise than that. He is arguing that Meghan entered royal life with a specific and deeply counterproductive assumption, that the press was an enemy to be defeated rather than a landscape to be navigated. And that assumption, Morgan says, was catastrophically wrong. Every senior royal who has survived long-term in the British public eye has understood one fundamental truth. You do not beat the British press. You cannot beat the British press. The papers have been there longer than any individual royal. They will be there after every individual royal is gone. The relationship between the monarchy and the media is not a fair fight, and it was never designed to be one. What successful royals do is manage that relationship. Carefully, strategically, sometimes uncomfortably. They give access when access serves them. They draw boundaries that the press eventually respects because those boundaries are maintained consistently and without drama. They do not declare war. Meghan declared war. Morgan says the declaration was not made in a single statement or a decision. It was made incrementally, through a series of choices in those early months that each sent the same signal: the decision to withdraw access that had previously been offered, and the decision to manage correspondence through lawyers rather than communications staff. The decision to position every piece of critical coverage as evidence of institutional racism, rather than engaging with the substance of what was being reported. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each one could be defended individually. Together, they constructed something that Morgan argues was irreversible. They constructed an adversarial dynamic that gave the British press both the motive and the permission to investigate Meghan with a ferocity that a more cooperative approach would never have generated. Morgan has a phrase he uses repeatedly when discussing this. He says Meghan handed her enemies a shovel and then complained about being buried. But here is where Morgan's argument becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because he does not stop at media strategy. He goes further. He argues that the same mistake, the same fundamental treatment of people as instruments rather than partners, manifested in every significant relationship Meghan explored during this period. Her father, Thomas Markle, was a complicated man, a man who made his own significant mistakes publicly, but a man who, Morgan argues, was managed and then discarded in a way that tells you something important about how Meghan approaches relationships that have become inconvenient. Her closest friends from her life before Harry, people who had known her for years, people who had supported her through the difficult periods of her acting career and her first marriage. They did not disappear from her life because they became hostile. They disappeared because access was withdrawn, because the circle contracted and the new world she was building had limited space for the old one. Morgan documents this pattern with a precision that is difficult to dismiss, and then he lands on the example that he considers the most revealing of all: the Oprah interview. Not the content of the interview, the decision to do it. Morgan argues that the Oprah interview represented the mistake in its purest and most consequential form, because the people most damaged by that interview were not just the royal family. They were not just King Charles or William or the institution itself. The people most damaged were the staff members who had stayed loyal, the courtiers who had tried to make the situation work, the palace aides who had absorbed enormous pressure and remained professionally committed to finding a path forward. Those people watched that interview and understood immediately that their loyalty had been treated as a given, that it had been used and it would never be reciprocated. And the moment they understood that, they stopped protecting her. Morgan says that is the mechanism through which one mistake becomes a downfall. It is not the original decision that destroys you. It is the chain reaction that follows when the people who might have saved you decide they no longer have a reason to try. By the time the Oprah interview aired, that chain reaction was already well underway inside the palace. But what most people still do not fully understand is how deeply that chain reaction penetrated, how far into the institution it reached, how many doors it permanently closed, and what it meant for every attempt to rebuild that came afterward. We will soon take you inside those walls, to the conversations that happened after the cameras stopped, and to the decisions that were made in the weeks and months following the mistake. to the moment senior members of the royal family looked at each other across a room and reached a conclusion that no official statement has ever fully captured: the palace, the press, and the point of no return. There is a moment in every institutional crisis when the people inside stop trying to fix the problem. They do not announce it. They do not hold a meeting where someone stands up and says the words out loud. It happens quietly, almost invisibly. A collective decision reached through a series of smaller decisions that each felt reasonable at the time. Tom Bower documented that moment inside the palace. Piers Morgan identified it from the outside, and both of them place it at exactly the same point in the timeline: the months immediately following the Oprah interview in March 2021. Before that interview, there were still people inside Buckingham Palace who believed a path forward existed. Not an easy path, or a comfortable one, but a workable arrangement that would allow the Sussexes to operate at a distance while maintaining some connection to the institution. Senior courtiers had been exploring options. Communications teams had been drafting frameworks. There were quiet back-channel conversations happening between representatives on both sides. None of that survived the broadcast. What Piers Morgan observed from his position in the British media was the speed with which that shift happened. He has described it on air multiple times, with a precision that people close to the palace have privately confirmed. Within 72 hours of the Oprah interview airing, the tone inside the institution changed completely, not publicly. Publicly, the measured statements continued, and the carefully worded acknowledgments of the issues raised were issued with the kind of diplomatic neutrality that the palace had spent centuries perfecting. But behind that public neutrality, something had hardened. Morgan argues that 3 specific things happened in those 72 hours that made reconciliation structurally impossible. Not emotionally difficult, not practically complicated, structurally impossible. The first was the skin color claim. The allegation that a member of the royal family had raised concerns about the potential skin color of Meghan's unborn child detonated across the world with a force that no institutional response could adequately address. The palace statement acknowledged the claims and noted that recollections may vary. That phrase became one of the most analyzed pieces of royal communication in modern history. Morgan noted something specific about the palace response. It was not a denial. It was not a confirmation. It was a deliberate construction designed to leave every interpretation simultaneously available. And that construction, he argued, told you everything about how frightened the institution was of the answer. Because if the claim was false, a direct denial would have been issued immediately. Institutions of that scale and that experience do not leave damaging allegations unaddressed, unless addressing them directly creates a bigger problem than the allegation itself. The silence around that specific claim was, Morgan argued publicly, deafening. The second thing that happened in those 72 hours was the British press. Now here is where Morgan's analysis becomes particularly interesting, because he is not simply a critic of Meghan in this chapter of the story. He is also a critic of the press, including, implicitly, himself. He has acknowledged that the British tabloid coverage of Meghan was at times excessive, at times unfair, and at times driven by factors that had nothing to do with legitimate public interest and everything to do with circulation figures and click rates. But Morgan's argument is that the Oprah interview removed the last restraint on that coverage. Before the interview, there were editors and journalists who had held back certain stories, certain angles and lines of investigation, not out of loyalty to Meghan, but out of a calculation that the story was still developing, and that the most damaging material should be held until the moment it would land with maximum impact. The Oprah interview told those editors the moment had arrived. What followed in the British press in the weeks and months after March 2021 was, Morgan argues, not a cause of Meghan's downfall. It was a consequence of the mistake. The press did not create the adversarial dynamic. They responded to one that had already been created, and they responded with all the ferocity and all the resources that the British tabloid machine deploys when it decides a target has made themselves fair game. The third thing that happened in those 72 hours was the most significant of all, and it happened not in a newsroom or a palace briefing room. It happened in a private conversation between senior members of the royal family that has never been fully reported. Morgan's sources have described the atmosphere in that conversation with remarkable consistency. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, No moment of operatic royal fury. There was something quieter and far more consequential. There was agreement. A quiet, calm, collective agreement among the people who held the institutional power of the British monarchy that the situation had passed the point where engagement was productive. From that point forward, the strategy changed completely. The palace stopped trying to manage the Sussex narrative. It stopped issuing responses and briefing again. It stopped doing anything that kept the story alive and gave the Sussexes an institutional opponent to define themselves against. It simply went quiet. And Morgan argues that this decision, this deliberate institutional silence, was the most devastating response the palace could have chosen. Because everything the Sussex brand had built, every speech, interview, Netflix documentary, carefully crafted public appearance, was constructed around the ongoing drama of their conflict with the institution. Remove the conflict and what remains? That question, Morgan says, is the one that the Sussex operation was never structurally prepared to answer, because the answer was uncomfortable. What remained without the conflict was a lifestyle brand with a shrinking audience, a production company with a stalling slate, and two people whose most powerful asset had been the ongoing war. Once the palace stopped fighting, the war was over, and Meghan, Morgan argues, had no plan for peace. But even as that realization was settling over the Sussex operation in California, something else was happening simultaneously. Something that crossed the Atlantic and landed in rooms, boardrooms, and social circles that Meghan had been carefully cultivating for years. The fallout was not staying in Britain, it was following her. The fallout that crossed the Atlantic. There is a particular kind of damage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a headline, a resignation letter, or a public statement of withdrawal. It arrives in unreturned emails, in invitations that stop coming, and in rooms that were once open and are now, without explanation, unavailable. That is the kind of damage Piers Morgan says followed Meghan Markle across the Atlantic, and it arrived faster than anyone in the Sussex operation had anticipated. Hollywood is not one industry. It is a collection of overlapping networks held together by relationships, reputation, and the collective memory of how people behave when things get difficult. Everyone in that world has a story about someone who seemed untouchable and then suddenly was not. Everyone has watched a brand collapse that looked permanent from the outside. They know the signs. And by late 2022, those signs were visible to anyone paying close attention. Morgan has been specific about what those signs looked like from his vantage point. He tracks 4 distinct areas where the fallout became measurable. Not theoretical or speculative, measurable. The first was Hollywood itself. When Harry and Meghan arrived in California in 2020, the initial response from the entertainment industry was warm. Genuinely warm. Deals were discussed. Projects were explored. Doors opened with a speed that reflected both genuine interest and the kind of commercial excitement that a globally recognized name generates automatically. But Hollywood has a long memory and a short tolerance for complexity. The Oprah interview created a problem that no amount of warmth could resolve. It tied the Sussex brand permanently to a level of controversy that most major studios and production partners are structurally unwilling to absorb. Not because they have strong feelings about the British royal family, but because controversy of that specific kind, unresolved, ongoing, and legally complicated, makes insurance harder. It makes talent nervous and makes the commercial calculation significantly less attractive. Projects stalled. Deals that had been closed quietly fell apart. The reasons given were always practical: scheduling conflicts, creative differences, shifting priorities. Morgan argues those reasons were rarely the real ones. The second area was philanthropy. Meghan had invested significant energy in building relationships with major American philanthropic institutions. The plan, as Morgan's sources describe it, was to establish the Sussex Foundation as a serious player in the global charitable landscape. A foundation with real credibility, partnerships, and influence beyond the entertainment industry. That plan required the cooperation of institutional donors and established philanthropic networks. Those networks did not cooperate. The reasons were similar to Hollywood, but with an additional layer of complexity. Major philanthropic institutions in America are extraordinarily sensitive to reputational risk. Their donors are often conservative in the broadest sense, cautious. protective of the causes they have spent years funding, deeply resistant to association with anything that generates the kind of sustained controversy the Sussex brand had accumulated by 2022. The foundation struggled to gain traction. Partnerships that seemed close did not materialize. The credibility Meghan had hoped to build in this space remained frustratingly out of reach. The third area was social. Montecito is a small community, wealthy, discreet, and deeply interconnected. The people who live there have known each other for years. Their social world is structured around relationships that predate any individual arrival and will outlast any individual departure. Meghan and Harry were welcomed initially with the genuine warmth that Montecito extends to high-profile newcomers. Oprah was a neighbor. The social possibilities seemed significant. But Morgan's sources describe a gradual cooling in those social connections that tracked almost precisely with the mounting controversy surrounding the Sussex brand. Dinners became less frequent, the warmth remained superficially, but the depth of engagement contracted. Nobody said anything directly, nobody needed to. In Montecito, as in Hollywood, the message travels without words. The fourth and most personally damaging area was friendships. Morgan has spoken extensively about this. The people who had publicly aligned themselves with Meghan in the immediate aftermath of the Oprah interview and the palace departure. The celebrities who had offered statements of support. The public figures who had positioned themselves visibly in her corner. By 2023, that visible support had become significantly quieter. Not hostile, quiet. And in Morgan's analysis, that quiet is more revealing than any public statement of withdrawal could ever be. Because the people who go quiet are not doing so randomly. They are responding to private information, to conversations had behind closed doors, to their own assessment of where the Sussex brand is heading and whether proximity to it still serves their interests. When the people who championed you loudest go quiet, Morgan argues, you are not facing a temporary setback. You are facing a verdict. And that verdict, delivered without announcement across 4 separate landscapes simultaneously, told the same story. Same story that Morgan had been telling publicly for years. The mistake had compounded. Each consequence had generated further consequences. And each closed door had made the next one harder to open. Each contracted relationship had made the remaining ones carry more weight than they were designed to bear. By 2024, the accumulation of those consequences had produced something that no single dramatic moment had created, a structural isolation, not the dramatic exile of someone cast out loudly, the quieter and far more permanent isolation of someone the world had simply moved on from. Morgan had predicted it, not with pleasure, he has been careful to say that publicly, but with the certainty of someone who recognized the pattern early, who had watched it develop from a moment that most people had completely overlooked, who had understood from the beginning that the mistake was not recoverable because the person who made it had never fully acknowledged making it. And that brings us to what Morgan himself considers the most important. Not the analysis or the history, not even the documented consequences. His verdict. What he believes this mistake ultimately cost Meghan Markle. What he thinks happens next. And the question he says nobody around her is brave enough to ask out loud. Morgan's final verdict, and what happens next. Piers. Morgan has spent years pursuing this story, and when he finally delivers his verdict on what the mistake ultimately cost Meghan Markle, it is not what most people expect. It is not cruel or triumphant. It is not the verdict of a man who got what he wanted and is enjoying the moment. It is something colder than all of that. And a conclusion. Morgan does not call Meghan a villain. He does not call her a victim. He steps entirely away from those categories and lands somewhere more precise, and concludes that Meghan Markle is a genuinely talented and capable woman, someone who made one mistake so fundamental that no amount of talent or capability could correct it afterward. The mistake was treating every relationship as a transaction. Morgan argues this is the one error that cannot be recovered from in public life. Not a scandal, failure, or controversy, transactionality. The moment people understand that your loyalty is conditional on their usefulness. Something changes permanently. Trust does not weaken gradually. It inverts completely. Every gesture becomes suspect, and every relationship becomes a calculation. And once that understanding spreads, it does not stop. Morgan watched it move outward from the palace to the press to Hollywood to Montecito. The same recognition traveling through different worlds and different languages, but carrying the identical meaning. She will use you while you are useful. And here's the question. Morgan says nobody in Meghan's circle is brave enough to ask. What does she actually want? Not the public answer. Or the carefully managed statement about humanitarian work and authentic storytelling. What does she actually want? Morgan argues that the inability to answer that question honestly is the engine behind every mistake that followed the original one. A transactional strategy only makes sense if you have a clear destination. If that destination keeps shifting the relationships you sacrificed to reach, it becomes simply relationships you destroyed, and the destination never arrives. Morgan does not end in devastation, though. He says Meghan is not finished. The same relentless ambition that drove the mistake does not dissolve under pressure. It adapts. But he adds something that neither her supporters nor her critics have fully reckoned with. He says he hopes she finds something quieter than a platform or a brand or a global audience. A relationship with the world that does not require management. Whether she finds it, even Morgan cannot say. Piers Morgan knew Meghan before the world did. What he witnessed from that London dinner to the Montecito silence tells a story bigger than any feud. One mistake, one pattern, and one consequence that kept compounding. The question now is not what went wrong. It is whether anything can still go right